The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials, named Jairus, came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come lay your hands on her that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed upon him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had, yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to Jesus, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they arrived at the house of the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this, and said that she should be given something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
You might have noticed something a little different about this gospel tonight. And no, I don't mean that it's a little longer than usual for ordinary time, as indeed it is. You might have noticed that. But the format is different. There are actually two miracle stories here, and usually in the Gospels we find one following another, sometimes several in succession, but that's not the case here. Here we have one story, the one of the woman who'd been afflicted with hemorrhaging for 12 years, who approaches Jesus and touches his cloak. Embedded in this larger tale of the synagogue official Jairus, whose daughter is ill and subsequently dies, but is raised by Jesus. And this format allows us to discern a polarity that speaks volumes about the person of Jesus and how he ministered to the wide range of people who approached him. Here we have a synagogue official from a class of religious leaders who were generally not sympathetic, not supporters of Jesus, people who in the gospel spent more time disputing with him than agreeing with him. And yet this man, whatever he might have thought about Jesus and his teachings, because he loves his daughter deeply, comes to this man who is preaching in the area of Galilee and asks for his help. And knowing Jesus as we do, of course, he responds affirmatively. But in the midst of this, before he can even answer this official's request, someone quite different comes along. Not an official, just an ordinary woman whose uncleanness in the eyes of the law has put her outside of it for these 12 years. Someone who, if unclean, could not even enter the synagogue to hear this official and his compatriots speak and preach and pray. And it points out something marvelous about Jesus. It didn't matter who someone was. It didn't matter whether they were an official or an ordinary person. It didn't matter whether they were rich or poor. It didn't matter whether they were people who had been the object of persecution or sometimes had persecuted and maltreated others themselves. Those who came to Jesus with an honest heart in their time of need were given a response, were helped, were healed, were cured, or their friends and relatives given those same benefits. It says something, I know, about the divinity of Jesus, that he could look upon every person, no matter who they were or where they came from, as a child of God. But it also says something of his extraordinary humanity, that he could look into a person's heart and know whether they were well-intentioned, selfless, seeking help whether for themselves or somebody else. He didn't care what positions people occupied, and he doesn't seem to have given much thought to whether people might have held different ideas than his own in a whole range of matters. He simply looked upon them as people who, as God's creatures, were good and deserving of his attention, and at times, like in this gospel, his healing power. That is a quality which is greatly lacking in many segments of our civil society and sometimes our church as well. The ability to see what we all have in common as children of God, rather than dwelling on the differences. We all have a very human inclination at times to prejudge people, to think about whether they are like us or whether we agree with them before we decide how much mercy and justice and love and attention we will parse out to them. But whether it's his divinity or his humanity, Jesus, as God's Son, was someone who ministered to people individually and personally without taking differences personally. It's an extraordinary quality to be able to separate those things out and care for people even if we don't like them or don't agree with them, because that is what Jesus Christ himself would have done. But it is not impossible for us. It is not impossible for human beings to be like Jesus in that manner. Is there any among us who does not have the capacity within him or herself to be more compassionate, to treat people with more decency, to be more fair or more just? As long as grace is abundantly given to us by God, all of us have that capacity. We may not be able to do the things that Jesus did in this gospel, whether it's curing somebody of a disease or raising a girl from the dead. Those are miracles with a capital M. But there is another level here, that extraordinary humanity of Jesus which operates with a small m, of which we are all capable. To look into the eyes of those around us and to see children of God first, and to simply respond to them in their need. And when we get on the same page as Jesus, with being decent and compassionate and caring and just, then we might say that, well, something like a small miracle happens whenever we are like him.